Is anyone coming for me? 5 words, spoken quietly, in the dark, by a man sitting in a manual wheelchair at a bus stop in Medina, Ohio, at 11:23 on a Tuesday night in late November. The temperature was 19 degrees. The wind chill was 8. A blizzard was 45 minutes away. Marcus Eldon Hayes had not asked for much in 82 years. He had not asked for mercy when a landmine detonated beneath him in the Mekong Delta in 1971 and compressed his spine at the T6 vertebra, ending his ability to walk at the age of 28. He had not asked for sympathy when he came home to a country that wasn't sure what to do with its veterans. He had not asked for recognition when they gave him the Silver Star, the decoration he now carried in his jacket pocket, his hand pressed against it through the fabric the way other men carry photographs of their children. What he had asked for, from a nursing home that had taken $412,000 of his money over 13 months, was basic care, heat, his medication, his power wheelchair back, the right to make a phone call. Every request had been denied. Every complaint had been buried. Every person who tried to help him had been removed, silenced, or managed. And when his VA benefits account reached 0, the man who ran that facility had sent him out into the cold without a phone, without a contact, without a single way to call for help, at 17 degrees, on a night a blizzard warning was already on every weather alert in Medina County. What Marcus didn't know, sitting at that bus stop, was that one of the men who had already died in this same facility had died in the same month, in the same weather, in circumstances that no one with authority had ever looked at closely enough. What he also didn't know was that the man on the motorcycle at the curb, the one with the scarred jaw and the leather cut and the USMC tattoo on his forearm, had buried a father in a county nursing facility and had spent 20 years asking himself what he should have done differently. This is their story, and it does not end the way anyone expects. If that hits you the way it hit me, subscribe, valiant bikers, because we are just getting started. Drop your city in the comments and stay with me. Every story on this channel is about what happens when someone refuses to look the other way. Is anyone coming for me? Marcus Hayes had not planned to say it. He had spent 54 years in a wheelchair learning not to ask for things because asking made people uncomfortable, and their discomfort had a way of becoming your problem. He had counted things instead. Telephone poles, passing cars, the cracks in sidewalks. He had been counting since Vietnam. It was how he kept fear manageable. He had counted 11 cars since 8 p.m. 11 cars in 3 hours and 11 minutes in 19-degree weather at a bus stop on Granger Mill Road where one panel of the corrugated shelter was missing and the wind came through it sideways, pushing fine, dry snow directly into his face and hands. His right hand was the one that pushed the wheelchair. He had been using it since 1971. It was bleeding now, cracked at 3 knuckles, the cold pulling the skin apart at the joints the way cold does when a man has been refused moisturizer for 8 months in a facility that kept the heat at 64 degrees and called it seasonal protocol. His core temperature, though he had no way of knowing the number, was 93.1 degrees. He knew he was losing time. His speech had been slurring for about 40 minutes. His hands shook in a way that was not voluntary. When he tried to look at his hands, his focus required deliberate effort. He was counting to keep himself here. And then the motorcycle pulled to the curb. It wasn't the first vehicle to stop near the shelter. Earlier, a county sheriff's deputy cruiser had slowed to approximately 8 miles an hour, close enough for Marcus to see the deputy's face clearly through the glass, close enough that he had straightened in his chair. The old reflex, the military bearing that 54 years in a wheelchair hadn't touched. And the deputy had looked at him for several long seconds and then accelerated away without stopping. He had been visible. The deputy had seen him, and still the cruiser had moved on. Before that, 2 women in their late 60s had approached the shelter, identifiable by the tote bags from Medina Community Fellowship and the "What Would Jesus Do" bumper sticker on the minivan they'd parked at the curb. They had looked at Marcus, whispered to each other, and then one of them had addressed him with the particular kind of performed concern that takes nothing out of the performer. "You really shouldn't be out here, sir. Have you tried calling 211? There are resources. We'll pray for you." And then they had gotten back into their warm minivan and driven away. He had not watched them leave. He had put his hand on the metal in his pocket. He had counted cars after that, cracks in the concrete. The irregular tick of the street lamp overhead, which cycled on and off every 40 or 50 seconds. The knock of a loose metal panel against the shelter frame in the wind. He had counted everything he could find to count. I need you to sit with that for a moment. 4 people. A couple, a young man, a deputy, 2 women with a scripture bumper sticker. Not one of them was cruel by nature. Not one of them woke up that morning planning to abandon a veteran in a blizzard. They were just busy, uncomfortable, certain that someone else would handle it. And that is precisely how a man who survived a landmine in 1971 ends up alone in the snow in 2024, not because of monsters, but because of ordinary people making ordinary decisions to keep moving. Ask yourself honestly, which car were you the last time you drove past someone who needed you to stop? And then the motorcycle pulled to the curb. Robert Malone, the man the Medina County chapter had called Ironclad for 22 years, a name earned not from any single act, but from the cumulative observation that he did not bend, was sitting astride his idled Harley with the engine off and the kickstand down, reading a hand-drawn map on a folded piece of paper. The rest of the club had stopped 40 feet back at a gas station. Robert rode point. He always rode point. He was 57 years old, 6'2", built like a man who had loaded shipping containers for 8 years before he found something he was better suited for. He had a deep horizontal scar running from his left jawline to his ear, shrapnel, Fallujah, 2004. Both forearms were sleeved in faded tattoos, the USMC globe and anchor on the left inner wrist, still clean after 30 years. His eyes were pale gray and absolutely still. Most people who saw him for the first time crossed to the other side of the street. The cut, the scar, the size, the silence. What they never saw. In his left breast pocket, folded to a specific crease that hadn't changed in 33 years, was a laminated copy of the Serenity Prayer. His father had pressed it into his hand the day he shipped out. He had not lost it. He had carried it through the Gulf War, through 12 years of active duty, through Fallujah, through 22 years of riding with brothers who understood that there were things you didn't put down. He was looking at the map when he heard it. Not loud, barely audible over the wind. But he had been trained to distinguish sounds in conditions where most people heard only noise, and what he heard was the low metallic groan of a wheelchair wheel badly in need of oil. A specific sound, 3 rotations, then silence, then 3 more. And underneath it, the concrete scrape of footrests moving toward him. He looked up. What he saw was an old man in an oversized field jacket, a beige skullcap unraveling at one seam, mismatched wool socks above Velcro shoes, moving through blowing snow in a manual wheelchair with a cracked left armrest. Moving slowly. His right arm doing all the work in short, deliberate strokes, his left supplementing in choppy bursts, his head down, watching the cracked concrete. Steam rising from his breath in ragged intervals. He was moving toward Robert. Not toward the gas station, not toward the road. Toward Robert, specifically. He stopped twice. Once to adjust his grip. Once because his right arm shook and he needed a moment to steady it. He did not look away from Robert between stops. He covered 14 feet of cracked concrete in what felt like a long time and a very short time simultaneously, and when he was close enough for Robert to see his face, the deep-set eyes the color of weathered driftwood, still sharp, a jaw prominent but sunken at the cheeks, a thin white beard, a 2-inch scar diagonal under his left eye, the oldest wound on his face. He stopped. He straightened his posture. An automatic thing, clearly. Decades of military bearing still operating, and he said it. "Is anyone coming for me?" 5 words, an entire life inside them. Robert Malone folded the map, slid it into his pocket, got off the bike. He walked to the wheelchair and crouched, not bent at the waist, a full crouching kneel, both knees on wet concrete, bringing himself below the eye level of the man in the chair. He did not speak immediately. He looked at this man for a moment, at the cracked hands, at the field jacket 2 sizes too large, at the shape of something in the left jacket pocket that Marcus's hand never left. "Someone is now," Robert said. "You're not alone." He put his hand, the one with the USMC tattoo, flat on the armrest of the wheelchair, not on Marcus's arm, on the chair, a specific placement, asking permission without asking. He kept his eyes on Marcus's eyes, and he waited. What he didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that the man in that wheelchair was carrying a recording in his head that would eventually result in a federal fraud investigation, a grand jury proceeding, and the arrest of a man who had already been responsible for 1 veteran's death and had calculated, with the cold precision of a man who had done this before, that winter would do the rest. But that was still 45 minutes away from mattering. Right now, what mattered was a man's core temperature dropping toward 90 degrees, a blizzard 3/4 of an hour from making the roads impassable, and one biker crouched in wet snow at a bus stop, holding eye contact with someone who had not had someone hold eye contact with him without an agenda in 8 months. The clock on Robert's phone said 11:27 p.m. The National Weather Service Blizzard Advisory said, "Onset 12:10 a.m. Temperature drop to 4 degrees Fahrenheit by 2 a.m. Snowfall rate 2 inches per hour." He did the math fast. 43 minutes. He stood, looked at Marcus, said, "I need to make a call. Don't go anywhere." Marcus said, almost inaudibly, "I've got nowhere to go, son." The call lasted 47 seconds. "Corpman, it's Ironclad. What's going on?" A pause. The weight of the next sentence settling into the cold air before he spoke it. "I need every brother within 30 miles at the Route 18 clubhouse in 20 minutes, and I need you at Granger Mill in Copperfield right now. I've got a paraplegic veteran, hypothermia setting in, and a blizzard 43 minutes out. We are not waiting for county EMS on this one." A beat. Say no more. I'm coming. The line went dead. And that was it. No questions about proof. No concerns about whether it was their business. No discussion of risk or liability or what might happen if they were wrong. Korsman, real name Thomas Garrett, 71 years old, former Navy combat medic who had served 2 tours in Vietnam's Mekong Delta, and who had, over 22 years with this chapter, treated frostbite and fractures and 100 things that would have required a hospital if the hospital had been reachable. Asked one question in 47 seconds, and that question was, what's going on? Not, are you sure? That was what brotherhood meant. Thomas Garrett arrived at the bus stop 11 minutes later, still pulling on his jacket, and crouched next to Marcus with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been checking vitals in bad conditions since 1971. He checked circulation in Marcus's hands, fingertips white, capillary refill slow. He checked Marcus's eyes, asked 3 orientation questions, listened to his breathing. He stood up and looked at Robert. We have maybe 38 minutes before his core temp hits 90, and we're dealing with cardiac risk. He needs a warm environment, dry clothes and IV fluids, not an ER waiting room. Somewhere we can get him stable fast. Clubhouse, Robert said. Clubhouse, Thomas agreed. And then Robert looked at Marcus, this man who had been sitting at this bus stop for 3 hours and 11 minutes, who had watched 11 cars pass without stopping, who had been told by 2 women quoting scripture that they would pray for him, and said, "Before we move, I need to ask you one thing. How did you end up here tonight?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. The way a man is quiet when he is deciding how much of the truth he can afford to spend. Then he said, "They put me out. The man who runs that place said my time was up, wouldn't let me make a call. Left me in that chair at the back entrance and told the overnight aide to log it as voluntary discharge." He paused. The shaking in his hands was visible now. "It's 19 degrees, son. They knew the storm was coming." Robert's jaw tightened. He said nothing. What he didn't know yet was that Marcus hadn't finished. By the time the first group of brothers reached the Route 18 clubhouse, Verdict pulling in first, then Chalk, then Cipher, then Anchor last, riding slow, his age in every gear change, Robert had Marcus in a recliner next to the wood stove, dry clothes from the supply closet replacing the institutional detergent-soaked field jacket, a mug of hot broth in his hands, Thomas monitoring pulse and color every 4 minutes. The clubhouse smelled like machine oil and wood smoke, and the specific warmth of a space that had been used by the same people for a long time. Marcus held the broth with both hands. He didn't drink it immediately. He held it and felt the warmth travel through his palms and watched the room with those driftwood gray eyes, taking inventory the way a man does when he has learned that safety is usually temporary. Verdict. His name was Dale Pruitt, before the road name, 63 years old, retired Medina County detective with 24 years on the force, a man who had left after a nursing home fraud case, was closed under pressure from a county commissioner whose brother-in-law happened to sit on the facility's board, pulled a chair close and sat. He had a yellow legal pad on his knee. He had been a detective long enough to know when to have the pad visible and when to put it away. He put it away. "You can talk in your own time," he said. "Nobody here is going anywhere." Chalk, formerly the principal of Medina's Lincoln Heights High School, retired after 31 years, now the one the chapter sent when someone needed a calm voice and a steady set of eyes, sat across the room and said nothing, which was its own kind of communication. Cipher. 36 years old, former Army intelligence analyst, the youngest full-patch member in the chapter, whose saddlebag always contained a ruggedized laptop and whose ability to find publicly available information at speed was considered borderline unsettling even by people who liked him, had the laptop open already. He was quiet about it. And Anchor, the club's co-founder, 74 years old, Navy Korean War veteran, a man who had been in this chapter since before some of its current members were born, sat in the back of the room in a wooden chair and did not speak. He was simply present, in the specific way that certain people are present, substantial, unhurried. Robert sat across from Marcus, not at the legal pad distance, close. He waited until Marcus had finished half the broth. Then he asked, "How long were you in that place?" 13 months, Marcus said. "And before that?" "I had an apartment, 19 years. They said I couldn't manage it anymore after the pneumonia." A pause. "I could manage it fine. I just didn't have anyone watching who knew the difference." Robert was quiet a moment. Then he said, "And he didn't plan to say it. It wasn't strategic. It just came out the way things do when you recognize a shape you know. My father was a Korean War veteran. He spent his last 16 months in a county facility in Summit County. They lost his medical records twice, denied his PTSD claim 3 times. He died in a shared room with a call button that hadn't worked in 6 weeks. He said it looking at Marcus. Not at his hands, not at the floor. At Marcus. He never told me the call button didn't work, Robert said. I found out after, from a nurse who felt bad. I've been trying to figure out what I should have done differently for a long time. Marcus looked at him, held the look for a moment in the way people do when they are deciding whether what they just heard was real. Then he said quietly, I have to tell you something I haven't told anyone yet. The room didn't change temperature, but something shifted in it. The way a room shifts when everyone in it simultaneously understands that what's coming next is the reason they're all there. Marcus set the broth down on the side table. He reached into the field jacket that was now folded on the arm of the recliner and found a small pocket Bible, the kind with a black cover worn to gray at the corners. He opened it to the inside back cover. Written there, in pencil, in the cramped handwriting of a man whose hands had been shaking when he wrote it, were 4 exchanges of dialogue. 4 weeks ago, Marcus said. A Thursday night, about 10:15. An aide forgot to take me back to my room after a late medication round. Left me at the end of the east corridor near the fire door. I could hear into the administrator's office when the door was open. He looked at the writing in the Bible. The administrator, Whitmore, was on the phone with his billing coordinator. I memorized what I heard. I said it to myself 11 times before I slept that night. Then I wrote it down. Robert leaned forward slightly. Marcus read from the inside cover of the Bible. Run the discharge sequence. I've done the math. We're done carrying him. A pause in the conversation he was recounting. I don't want paperwork problems. File it as voluntary. He doesn't have anyone watching close enough to push back. Another pause. $400,000 over 13 months, Darren. $400,000. And now he's a liability. The last pause. Same as Kowalski. Remember Kowalski? You let the clock run the problem. Winter does the rest. And then the billing coordinator's voice, hesitant. What if someone finds him before? And Whitmore. Then they find an 82-year-old man with dementia who wandered. Who are they going to believe? Marcus closed the Bible, put it in his lap. His hand rested on the cover. The room was silent. The wood stove ticked. Somewhere outside, The wind had picked up, the advance edge of the storm. A door somewhere in the building shifted in its frame. Robert's jaw was tight. He was looking at the Bible, not at the man holding it. At the Bible. He looked up. "Who's Kowalski?" he asked. "A man who was in that facility before me," Marcus said. "Korean War veteran. Room 9W. He died in November 2 years ago. They found him in the courtyard, unresponsive. The death certificate said hypothermia. Accidental." Nobody spoke for a moment. And then verdict said, quietly, from across the room, setting his legal pad back on his knee. "Raymond Kowalski. I know that name." You might be thinking you know what happens next. 200 bikers rolling up to a nursing home, engines loud, fists ready, chaos and noise and a confrontation that ends in somebody getting put through a wall. That's the story the patch suggests. That's the story most people write before they've met the men wearing it. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter than that, more disciplined, more dangerous in the ways that matter, because Robert Malone had spent 22 years watching what fear and anger produced when they weren't aimed correctly, and he had made a decision somewhere in his late 30s that the point wasn't to feel righteous. The point was to get the job done in a way that the person who needed protecting actually stayed protected. He looked around the room. At verdict with the legal pad. At Cypher with the laptop already pulling Sycamore Ridge Care Center's LLC filings. At Thomas, still monitoring Marcus's pulse every 4 minutes. At Chalk, who had his phone out and was already writing down the name of Marcus's grandniece in Cincinnati. At Anchor, in the back, saying nothing. "We're going to do this right," Robert said. Not to Marcus, to the room. "That means documentation first. It means we understand what we're walking into before we walk into it. And it means he glanced at Marcus, is never alone again tonight." Marcus looked at him. Robert said, "You said you've been counting things since Vietnam. Count on this. You're not going back to that place. Not tonight, not ever. What you heard 4 weeks ago, what's in that Bible, we're going to make sure it gets to people who can do something with it. And what happened to Kowalski is going to get looked at again. By people who can't be managed by a man with a Rotary Club membership and a smile." He stood, turned to the line of men in the room. "Cypher, pull everything. LLC filings, property records, billing history if it's accessible in public records. Verdict, I need everything you remember about the Kowalski case and who shut it down. Chalk, find the grandniece. Don't let the facility get to her first." He turned back to Marcus. "What's in your pocket? Can I see it?" Marcus reached into the folded jacket. He pulled out the Silver Star, Regulation 1971 issue, the silver gone dark to pewter over 54 years, the ribbon frayed but intact, and held it out on his palm. He said nothing. Robert looked at it for a long moment, did not touch it, just looked. Then he said quietly, "You earned this country, and this country is going to answer for tonight." He looked at Marcus's eyes. "That's not a favor. That's an obligation." He straightened, turned to the brothers, raised his right fist once, slow, deliberate. "Let's go to work." And now, armed with a Bible's inside cover, a dead man's name, and 75 motorcycles idling in the cold outside Route 18, Robert Malone was about to walk into the ugliest thing he'd found in 22 years of finding ugly things. He just didn't know yet how much uglier it was going to get. By 12:47 a.m., the blizzard had arrived. The first serious snowfall hit Medina County at 12:09, 1 minute ahead of the National Weather Service projection. And within 20 minutes, the roads had gone from passable to cautious to something that the county's overnight dispatch coordinator would later describe in the incident log as hazardous travel conditions, all non-emergency vehicles advised against movement. 75 motorcycles were moving anyway. They came down Route 18 in disciplined formation. 3 columns, tight, smooth. The kind of precision that comes from years of riding together in conditions that would have separated less practiced riders. Robert rode point, as always. Behind him, the formation stretched back far enough that the last riders were invisible through the snow. The rumble started low and distant from the perspective of anyone inside the buildings they passed, like thunder rolling in from the lake, like something building on the horizon that hadn't peaked yet. Then it grew. Windows vibrated. A car alarm on a side street triggered, and no one came out to check it. They did not roar. They moved. There is a difference, and anyone who has seen 75 motorcycles operating with military discipline understands what it is. This was not a mob. This was not a protest fueled by adrenaline and noise. This was coordinated movement with a specific objective, executed by men who knew exactly what they were doing and why, and who understood, with the collective intelligence of people who had been underestimated their entire adult lives, that the most powerful thing they could bring to 4,400 Fenwick Road tonight was not anger. It was presence, absolute, unmovable, fully documented presence. Sycamore Ridge Care Center looked, from the outside, like exactly what it advertised itself to be. A 2-story brick facility set back from Fenwick Road behind a curved driveway with solar-powered landscape lighting. A sign at the entrance in warm gold lettering, Sycamore Ridge Care Center, where compassion meets excellence. Decorative pots flanking the front doors, empty now in November, the dead stalks of summer flowers still in them, uncleared. A vinyl banner above the entrance reading, "Honoring our veterans. Thank you for your service." The banner had been up since Veterans Day, 3 weeks ago. Beneath it, the facility that had charged Marcus Eldon Hayes $412,000 over 13 months, withheld his prescribed nerve pain medication on a rotating basis, disconnected his call button, lost his power wheelchair, removed his outgoing mail, intercepted his communications with his family, and then discharged him into 19-degree weather with $23 and no phone 2 days before a blizzard. That facility was dark and quiet at 12:47 a.m. Its overnight staff reduced to the skeleton crew that Gerald Whitmore had been running on East Corridor nights for the past 8 months to maximize margin. The 75 motorcycles parked in the overflow lot across the street, one by one in perfect formation. Engines cut off in sequence until only silence remained. The specific, weighted silence that follows a sustained and deliberate sound. The snow continued falling. The banner above the entrance rippled once in the wind. The brothers stood there, not moving, not shouting. Present. 15 riders crossed with Robert. Now, you might be expecting what comes next to look a certain way. 60 leather-jacketed men filling a lobby. Voices raised. Someone behind a desk pressing a panic button. Chaos as leverage. That is not what happened. That is not how this worked. Robert Malone had done this before. Not this specific thing, but the version of this thing that required walking into an institutional space and making himself understood by people trained to manage difficult visitors. He knew what got results and what got footage. He chose results. He walked in with Verdict on his left, Thomas on his right, and Cypher one step behind. He was calm. He was courteous to the overnight receptionist, a woman in her 30s who looked up from her phone screen and went still at the sight of them. He showed her Marcus's pocket Bible. He said, "I need to speak to whoever is in charge of this facility tonight. This is not a social call, but it is a peaceful one, and I need you to make that call in the next 60 seconds." The receptionist made the call. The overnight supervisor, a man named Phil Garrett, no relation to Thomas, 58 years old, who had worked the overnight shift at Sycamore Ridge for 6 years, and who was not Gerald Whitmore, and was not, when you looked at him, a predator of any kind, came down the hallway with the specific expression of a man who understood immediately that something had shifted beyond his authority to manage. He listened for 4 minutes. Verdict showed him the pocket Bible. Thomas showed him Marcus's admission records, which Cypher had pulled from the Ohio Department of Health's public database on his laptop in the parking lot 40 minutes earlier. The overnight supervisor looked at the Bible's inside cover. He looked at the discharge paperwork Cypher had printed. The paperwork listing Marcus's departure as voluntary self-discharge, signed with a signature that did not match Marcus's handwriting on any of his VA intake forms. He sat down in a chair in the hallway. "I knew something was wrong on that corridor," he said. His voice had gone quiet. "I've been on nights for 6 years. I knew." He looked at Verdict. "I have a family. I told myself someone else would handle it." Verdict wrote that down. Beverly Oaks had been waiting for this call for 8 months. She was 64 years old, a certified nursing aide who had worked the East Corridor of Sycamore Ridge for 4 years before she was terminated on a Tuesday morning in a meeting that lasted 7 minutes. She had filed an internal complaint about medication irregularities, specifically that the PRN pain medications for East Corridor residents were being logged as administered on dates when Beverly, reviewing the cart, could account for the medications being physically present and undispensed. She had documented it. She had submitted it in writing. And 8 days later, Gerald Whitmore had filed a counter-complaint with the Ohio Board of Nursing Home Administrators, alleging that Beverly had falsified care records. She was currently unemployed. She had been told not to discuss the matter while the review was open. Chalk found her at 1:15 a.m. She lived 11 minutes from the facility. When Chalk explained who he was and why he was calling, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been sitting on this for 8 months because I was afraid of what he'd do to my certification. Tell me where to come." She arrived 20 minutes later, still in her coat, with a manila folder she had kept in a fireproof box under her bed since the day she was terminated. She sat across from Verdict, who had the legal pad out now, and she talked for 31 minutes. What she had seen. On 14 separate occasions between months 4 and 11 of Marcus's admission, she had checked the East Corridor medication cart and found PRN pain medications for Marcus, prescribed by his VA physician for documented nerve damage from the spinal injury, physically present and unrecorded. The log showed them as dispensed. They had not been dispensed. She had the dates. She had written them down on the day she noticed, every time, in a small spiral notebook she had bought specifically for the purpose after the 3rd time she'd seen it happen. When she had first noticed it, month 4. The same month Marcus's power wheelchair was transferred to maintenance. Why she had stayed silent initially. He told every aide on that corridor that if a resident's family called about complaints, it meant the resident was having a cognitive episode, and our job was to document the episode, not relay the complaint. I believed him for the first 2 months. By month 4, I knew it wasn't true. By month 6, I was terrified of him. How she felt now. She pressed her hands flat on the table when she spoke. She had been doing that since she sat down, pressing both palms flat, as if anchoring herself to the surface. Her voice held until she said Marcus's name, and then it broke on the word, and she stopped, and gathered herself, and continued. I should have gone to the state board sooner, she said. Not the facilities board, the state. I knew the difference, and I didn't do it. Beverly Oaks did exactly what we tell ourselves we would do. She saw something wrong, and she said so. And it cost her her job, her income, and 8 months of her life fighting a counter-complaint from the man she reported. So here is the harder question underneath this story, not, would you help someone in trouble? Most people watching this right now would say yes without hesitation. The question is, would you help when helping costs you something real? Your job, your reputation, your sense of not wanting to make things worse. That gap between the person we believe we are and the choice we make when it's inconvenient, that gap is where people like Marcus disappear. She reached into the folder and placed the spiral notebook on the table. 14 entries, she said. Dated, initialed. He can't say I made them up after the fact. You can see the ink aging. I wrote them in ballpoint, and then switched to a pen I bought at CVS in month 7 when I ran out of the first one. The color changes at entry 9. Verdict looked at the notebook. He looked at Beverly. You did the right thing, he said. She shook her head slightly. I did the right thing 8 months late. The anonymous aide, the one who had photographed 3 pages of East Corridor medication records on her personal phone, texted Cypher at 1:48 a.m. with a single message. I heard you were here. I can't come in person, but I can send you what I have. She sent the images 4 minutes later. Cypher printed them at the clubhouse's back-office printer via remote connection and had them on the table at Fenwick Road by 2:10 a.m. The records showed a systematic pattern. Marcus's scheduled pain medications marked administered at 8 p.m. on nights when the overnight log, a separate document, showed Marcus as agitated and uncooperative, a designation that, in Whitmore's behavioral documentation system, constituted grounds for restricting visitor access and flagging family communications as elevated concern periods. The agitation was from unmedicated nerve pain. The documentation of the agitation was then used to justify the isolation that prevented anyone from finding out about the unmedicated nerve pain. Verdict stared at the printed pages for a long moment. That's not negligence, he said. That's architecture. Terry Mack had been processing VA benefits claims from the Akron Regional Office for 19 years. He was 69 years old, a careful man, a man who believed that rules existed for reasons, and that the reasons mattered more than the convenience of breaking them. He had flagged Sycamore Ridge's billing account 7 months ago, specifically $74,800 in billed supplemental sensory therapy and enhanced mobility services charged against Marcus's aid and attendance benefit with no corresponding progress notes or licensed therapist signatures. He had forwarded his concern to his supervisor, as instructed. His supervisor had told him to forward the concern to the facility and take no further action. He had done that. He had followed the process. He had followed the process because the process was what separated his job from anarchy, and he had believed for 7 months that the process would eventually work. When Cypher reached him by phone at 2 a.m., Terry Mack listened to what Cypher described for about 90 seconds, and then said quietly, "I have the original flag documentation. I have my supervisor's response. I have the email I sent to the facility contact that was acknowledged but never answered. I can send all three to whatever address you give me in the next 5 minutes." He sent them in 3. "I followed the process," he told Cypher before he hung up. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite a question. "I thought the process would—" "It didn't," Cypher said, not unkindly. "But what you have helps." The line was quiet for a moment. "Tell me he's okay," Terry Mack said. "He's alive," Cypher said. "He's warm. We're working on the rest." Gerald Whitmore lived in Fair Lawn, Ohio, a 20-minute drive from Fenwick Road on a clear night, 35 in the storm. When Robert and Verdict and 2 brothers arrived at his house at 2:31 a.m., Gerald Whitmore was in his kitchen. He was making a grilled cheese sandwich. He had the radio on, a Cleveland overnight sports talk program, the host debating a caller about the Browns' offensive line. He was wearing a gray Henley and plaid flannel pants and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He had a spatula in his right hand. The kitchen smelled like butter and warm bread. This was the man who had written, in an email to his billing coordinator 6 weeks earlier, "Hayes account hits 0 end of month. Start discharge documentation. Frame as behavioral." This was the man who had told his overnight aide to log an 82-year-old paraplegic veteran's discharge as voluntary on a night when the temperature was 17 degrees and a blizzard was incoming. This was the man who had said, on a phone call 4 weeks ago, "Same as Kowalski. Remember Kowalski? You let the clock run the problem. Winter does the rest." He looked up when he heard the knock, pushed his glasses down to his nose, and opened the back door. What happened in the next 12 minutes followed a pattern that Robert had seen before. Not in nursing homes, but in other places where a man of practiced charm encounters a situation his charm cannot resolve. It moved through phases as predictably as weather. Phase 1 lasted about 4 minutes, the shoulders dropping into practiced ease, the palms open, the short, self-deprecating laugh designed to establish rapport. Gerald Whitmore had been managing difficult people for 25 years. He was good at it. He looked at Robert and said, with the warm baritone that the Medina Rotary Club had heard introduce veterans' family donation drives for 3 consecutive years, "I think there's been a real misunderstanding here, and I want to help clear it up. Marcus Hayes was discharged through our standard protocol. I personally reviewed his paperwork. He made the request himself. I have documentation. Now, I don't know what he's told you, but Marcus has been experiencing some significant cognitive—" Robert said. "What was the balance in his VA aid and attendance account on the day you filed the discharge authorization?" 1 second. Maybe slightly less. The practiced ease went somewhere else. Phase 2 was shorter. Legal jeopardy as a weapon, deployed with the confidence of a man who had used it successfully on social workers and ombudsman inspectors, and one deputy who had come to the door a year ago with a folder of resident documentation and a 40-minute tour of the West Wing. "You are on my private property at 2:30 in the morning. Whatever you think you have, I want you to understand that my attorney will be contacted within the hour, and what you're describing, the trespass, the harassment, the interference with a licensed healthcare operation, these are serious legal." "The FBI," Robert said, "is going to want to speak to your attorney too." He did not raise his voice. He said the 3 letters, FBI, The way you say a name that changes the weight of a room. Gerald Whitmore's face shifted. He understood, in that moment, that this was not a conversation he could manage his way out of. Phase 3 lasted under 2 minutes. A man stripped of his tools reaches for the last lever available. The presentation of himself as a victim. Stress of the business. The burden of regulatory compliance. The ingratitude of residents whose care he had dedicated his life to providing. You have no idea what it takes to run a facility like this. He had a difficult childhood. He mentioned it, briefly, as if it were relevant. He had sacrificed financial opportunity to do work that mattered. He had been misunderstood his entire career by people who didn't understand what the work required. Robert looked at him for a moment. Then he said quietly, 6 words. I'm not interested in your reasons. He looked directly at Whitmore. Neither is he. What happened then was not a strategy. It was what lives underneath the strategies when the strategies run out. Gerald Whitmore went still. The performance, the warmth, the jeopardy, the sympathy, fell off his face the way a coat falls from a hook when the nail finally gives. What was left underneath was not remorse. It was not guilt. It was the expression of a man who had been very careful for a very long time and who understood, with the sudden clarity of someone watching a door close on a room they cannot re-enter, that he had miscalculated once and that the miscalculation was terminal. His hands, which had been open and demonstrative throughout phases 1 through 3, closed at his sides. He said, I was careful. His voice was different. Not the baritone, something flatter. I was so careful. The police arrived 4 minutes later. Medina County Sheriff's deputies, 3 units, summoned by verdict 45 minutes earlier with a specific list of what they were going to find and where to find it. Gerald Whitmore did not resist. He stood in his kitchen doorway, still in the Henley and flannel pants, while they read him his rights. He asked once, quietly, if someone could call his neighbor about his dog. Whether someone would make sure the dog was fed. As if the dog were the thing that needed handling. As if the world he had built, and the lives he had destroyed within it, could wait while he sorted out the logistics. He was charged that night with elder financial abuse, fraudulent billing of federal benefits, unlawful discharge of a dependent resident into life-threatening conditions, and falsification of medical records. Additional charges would follow within 72 hours. Bail was set at $500,000. Gerald Whitmore, whose net worth was estimated at $2.1 million, could have made bail. His accounts, by the time bail was set, had been frozen by an emergency court order filed at 4 a.m. by a federal prosecutor whose name would become relevant in the morning. He did not make bail. He was remanded to Medina County Correctional Facility. When the deputy guided him through the kitchen door, he glanced back at the stovetop. The grilled cheese had burned. The smoke alarm, somehow, had not gone off. Justice had been served. But justice wasn't the ending. It was only the beginning. Robert was back at the clubhouse by 3:40 a.m. Marcus was asleep in the recliner, the silver star on the side table next to him, Thomas monitoring his breathing from across the room. His core temperature had come up to 97.2. His hands were no longer shaking. In sleep, the military bearing softened, the jaw unclenched, the deep-set driftwood eyes still, the thin face settling into something that looked, for the first time in the night, simply old and simply tired, rather than old and fighting. Thomas looked at Robert when he came in. Robert shook his head slightly. Not a negative, a settling, the gesture of a man who has done the thing that needed doing and is now processing the weight of it. He poured coffee. Sat. Cypher was still at the table. He had been working without pause since they'd arrived, and what his laptop had produced in the previous 3 hours was spread across the table in printed pages, organized by verdict into a sequence that told a story. Robert looked at the pages. "Show me," he said. Cypher had started with the public record, Sycamore Ridge Care Center's LLC filings, through the Ohio Secretary of State database, cross-referenced with property records in Summit and Medina counties. Layer 1 had taken 11 minutes. What it showed, Sycamore Ridge Care Center, LLC, was a subsidiary of a parent company called Fenwick Care Holdings, which was itself majority-owned by a holding entity registered in Delaware called GW Meridian Partners, LLC. All 3 entities listed the same registered agent. The registered agent's address was Gerald Whitmore's home in Fair Lawn. Layer 2 had taken 22 minutes, pulling VA billing records through the public audit database the Office of Inspector General maintained for flagged providers. Sycamore Ridge had been flagged once, 14 months ago. The flag Terry Mack had filed. The flag had been administratively closed with a notation: provider contacted, documentation requested, provider unresponsive, matter referred to Ohio Department of Health for routine inspection. The Ohio Department of Health inspection had found minor procedural issues, no resident harm identified, follow-up scheduled in 18 months. Layer 3 took Cypher 47 minutes, and when he found what he found, he sat back from the laptop and said quietly, to no one in particular, "There's another one." Verdict leaned in, looked at the screen. The name was not Raymond Kowalski, not yet. The name was Walter Finn, age 77 at the time of admission. Korean War veteran, former machinist from Barberton, Ohio, admitted to Sycamore Ridge Care Center in March 2020. V. A aid and attendance benefit recipient. Personal savings. Documented at approximately $41,000 at admission. Discharged, listed as voluntary, in February 2021. 11 months after admission. Cause of death: pneumonia with cardiac complications. Date of death: 6 weeks after discharge. Location: Akron City Hospital Emergency Department, where he had been brought by a neighbor who found him unresponsive in his apartment. His apartment. He had an apartment to be discharged to. But the VA benefits account, Cypher found in a subsequent pull from the public audit trail, had been charged $116,000 over 11 months for services that included. And here Cypher read directly from the screen, his voice flat. Enhanced cognitive engagement programming, specialized mobility rehabilitation, premium nutritional counseling, and individualized sensory integration support. Walter Finn's death certificate listed no next of kin. Nobody had filed a complaint. Nobody had looked. 3 years before Kowalski, verdict said. He was not looking at the screen. He was looking at the table. And Kowalski 2 years before Marcus. Same season, same billing pattern, same discharge framing. He picked up his pen. Put it down. This isn't a nursing home administrator who cut corners, he said. This is a man who developed a system and ran it 3 times. Nobody spoke. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a motorcycle that had been left running cut off. The wood stove ticked, and every man in that room understood, without saying it out loud, that they had not simply saved Marcus Eldon Hayes from a cold night at a bus stop. They had walked into the third iteration of a predatory operation that had already taken 2 men's lives and had been calibrated, with each repetition, to avoid detection. Darren Howell had been Gerald Whitmore's billing coordinator for 6 years. He was 44 years old, possessed a bachelor's degree in health services administration from a mid-tier Ohio university, drove a Hyundai Sonata he was 2 payments behind on, and had told himself for 6 years that his job was to manage billing and that what happened to residents was a matter above his pay grade. He had been on the phone call with Whitmore 4 weeks ago. He had heard the same words Marcus had memorized. He had said, "What if someone finds him before?" and had stopped because the answer Whitmore gave him had been clear enough to understand and terrifying enough to want to stop hearing. He had gone home that night and made dinner. He had watched television. He had gone to sleep. He had done this for 4 weeks. Verdict found him at his apartment in Brunswick at 5:15 a.m. He knocked twice. Darren Howell answered the door in the specific state of a man who has been awake and expecting this knock for several hours, dressed, hollow-eyed, holding his phone like it was evidence he hadn't decided whether to surrender. Verdict showed him the pocket Bible. Howell looked at the handwriting on the inside back cover. Looked at it for a long time. "I want to talk to a lawyer," he said. "You can have one," Verdict said. "Before or after you decide whether to cooperate with a federal investigation that already has your name on a phone record. Your call, Darren." He said it without malice, without theater. The way a man who spent 24 years investigating things says something true. Darren Howell sat down in the doorway of his own apartment, still holding his phone, and talked for 19 minutes. What he revealed: 2 billing accounts, one under a subsidiary LLC cipher had not yet found, registered in Indiana, used specifically to receive wire transfers from residents' personal accounts, routed to avoid the $3,500 reporting threshold. Walter Finn's account, Raymond Kowalski's account, Marcus's account. 3 sets of transfers, each below threshold, each to the same receiving account. He also confirmed that the discharge of Marcus Hayes had been calendared 3 weeks in advance, that the paperwork had been prepared before Marcus was notified, that the notation of voluntary self-discharge had been Whitmore's instruction, verbatim, in a text message Howell had screenshotted and never deleted because some part of him that still functioned had understood that this was the kind of thing you did not delete. He sent the screenshot to Cypher's number at 5:34 a.m. Verdict put his pen down. "You saw what happened to those men," he said. Not loud. "And you kept billing." Darren Howell looked at the floor. "I know," he said. His voice was a flat thing. No defense in it, no mitigation, just a man who had weighed the calculation and made the wrong choice, and who had known, on some floor of himself, that it was wrong, and had made it anyway. This, the narrator understood, was the harder thing to look at. Not Whitmore. Whitmore was a predator, a man who made a calculation and pursued it with operational precision. That was comprehensible in the specific way that monstrous things, once named, become comprehensible. This was something else. This was a man who could have ended it and chose not to. A man who had heard the words, "Winter does the rest," and had gone home and eaten dinner. Not because he was evil, because he was afraid. And because being afraid felt, from the inside, sufficiently like innocence. It wasn't innocence. The system, Robert would think later, didn't fail because it was corrupt at every level. It failed because at the levels where it wasn't corrupt, it was occupied by Darren Howells, people who knew and said nothing, who followed procedure and called it neutrality, who told themselves that someone else would handle it because someone else handling it meant they didn't have to. 3 veterans were dead, or nearly dead, because enough Darren Howells had been in the right places at the right times. That was harder to prosecute than Whitmore, and it was the part that stayed. The FBI agent arrived at the Route 18 clubhouse at 7:20 a.m. Her name was Special Agent Dana Reyes, Cleveland Field Office, Financial Crimes and Elder Fraud Division. She was 43 years old, dressed in practical civilian clothes, dark slacks, a thermal layer, no performance of authority. She had been awake for 19 hours. The exhaustion in her face had the specific quality of someone who has been working a case for longer than the case should have taken, and the coffee she was carrying when she walked in was not her first of the morning. She introduced herself to Robert. 2 sentences: name, office, division. He nodded once, did not extend his hand. She looked at the table, the printed pages, the phone with Darren Howells' screenshot already displayed, the pocket Bible in the center, the spiral notebook Beverly Oaks had produced. She said, "I'm told you have something relevant to an open federal investigation." Robert said, "Depends on what you're investigating." A beat. "Gerald Whitmore," she said, "and Fenwick Care Holdings." Robert looked at the brothers. A decision traveled the room without words. He pulled a chair out from the table, gestured to it. She sat. "How long has your office known about Whitmore?" Robert asked. The agent looked at him steadily. 14 months, she said. "We opened the case when a VA billing analyst flagged an irregular pattern in the aid and attendance accounts. We've been building a financial case through proper channels, subpoenas, audit requests, LLC filings. We needed a direct connection between the financial extraction and the resident harm to elevate to federal fraud with bodily injury. We had the pattern. We didn't have the connection." 14 months. Marcus had been inside Sycamore Ridge for 13. Robert didn't raise his voice. He let the math sit in the room. "We had him out in 4 hours, he said. "You had 14 months. Agent Reyes had no response that would have helped. She knew it. She accepted the silence with the specific dignity of someone who understands that some accountability cannot be argued away. Then she looked at the table. "Show me what you have," she said. Robert laid it out as a physical sequence. Documents placed one at a time, each landing with its own weight. The pocket Bible first, the spiral notebook, Beverly's entries, the screenshot from Darren Howell, the VA billing records Terry Mack had sent, Cypher's printed financials, the LLC chain, the Indiana subsidiary account, the wire transfer log. Last, a single printed page. 3 names, 3 admission dates, 3 discharge dates, 3 financial totals. Walter Finn, Raymond Kowalski, Marcus Eldon Hayes. Agent Reyes reviewed each item. When she reached the wire transfer log, she set her pen down. She leaned forward slightly. She did not speak for several seconds. "The Indiana subsidiary," she said. "We knew the Delaware entity. We didn't have the Indiana routing." She looked at Cypher. "How did you find this?" "State Business Registry," Cypher said. 47 minutes. She looked at the table. "This fills a gap we haven't been able to close for over a year." Robert said, "One condition for full cooperation." She looked at him. Marcus Hayes gets a victim advocate assigned before the first federal interview. Nobody asks him to relive a single thing without someone in his corner who is there specifically for him. Not for the case. For him. She nodded. That's already standard protocol in a case with bodily injury allegations. I want it confirmed in writing before the interview is scheduled. You'll have it by noon. She stood. Gathered the documents, leaving Robert the originals, taking photographs with a dedicated case device she produced from her jacket. At the door, she paused. Agent Reyes, Robert said. She turned. Do right by him. A beat. That's the only thing I'm asking. She held his gaze for a moment. That's the job, she said. The door closed. The room was quiet. The system, Robert knew, wasn't broken. People said it was broken when things like this happened, and he understood the impulse, but it wasn't accurate. A broken system was fixable. You identified the failure point and you repaired it. This system worked exactly as it had been designed, built to move carefully, to require documentation, to protect due process, even at the cost of the person inside it running out of time. Nobody had designed it to be cruel. It had simply turned out, sometimes, to be slow. Slow in ways that cost Walter Finn 6 weeks after discharge. Slow in ways that cost Raymond Kowalski a November morning in a courtyard. Slow in ways that had cost Marcus Hayes 19 degrees and 3 hours and 11 minutes and a core temperature of 93.1 degrees. The brothers hadn't replaced the system. They had bought the time the system needed to work. That wasn't a small thing. It wasn't a comfortable thing, either. But it was the accurate thing, and Robert had always preferred accuracy to comfort. The full scope assembled on the table by 8:30 a.m. 3 victims, spanning 5 years. Walter Finn, Raymond Kowalski, Marcus Eldon Hayes, all military veterans, all aid and attendance benefit recipients, all admitted during periods of medical vulnerability, all financially exhausted within 11 to 13 months, all discharged or deceased in late autumn. Total funds extracted across all 3 accounts. $689,000, including billing fraud, personal account draws, and VA benefit overclaiming. Timeline of operation. 2020 through the night of Marcus's discharge, 5 years of identical pattern, each iteration refined, each one more difficult to trace because the one before it had taught Whitmore where the oversight gaps were. The charges that would be filed, 6 in total, confirmed by Agent Reyes in a 9 a.m. call. Elder financial abuse, federal benefit fraud, unlawful endangerment of a dependent adult resulting in bodily harm, falsification of federal medical billing records, conspiracy to commit financial fraud against federal benefit programs, and, because of what Darren Howell's testimony implied about Raymond Kowalski's final days and the unlocked courtyard door, negligent homicide, pending investigation. 6 charges. 3 victims. 5 years. $689,000. And for 5 years, a system designed specifically to catch this had looked at it and found minor procedural issues. Not because it couldn't see, because it had been shown only what Whitmore wanted it to see, and because the people inside the system, who might have looked harder, had been managed, transferred, terminated, or scared into silence. 3 veterans, Robert thought, looking at the page. 3 men who survived wars and came home and lived their lives and ended up in a room that was 9 by 11 feet with a disconnected call button. 3 men the system was supposed to protect. He turned the page face down. Justice had been served. But justice wasn't the ending. It was only the beginning. Marcus Eldon Hayes was examined at Medina County Hospital's emergency department at 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in late November. Thomas sat in the waiting room while the examination happened. He had brought a thermos of coffee and a folded wool blanket from the clubhouse supply closet. Not for himself, for Marcus, because the examination rooms in the ED ran cold, and Thomas had been doing this long enough to think 3 steps ahead. When the attending physician, Dr. Priya Anand, came out to find the large man in the leather cut sitting alone in the waiting area with a folded blanket on his knee, she stopped. "Are you family?" she asked. Thomas looked up. "Brotherhood," he said. "Close enough?" She considered this for a moment. Then she sat down across from him and told him what she had found. Core temperature, on arrival, fully restored to 98.4 degrees, owing to the warming measures Thomas had implemented at the clubhouse. Early-stage frostbite on 3 fingers of the right hand, the pushing hand, the one that had driven the wheelchair through cracked concrete and blowing snow for 3 hours and 11 minutes. 2 stage 2 pressure wounds on Marcus's left hip, consistent with a mattress that had not been rotated in a significant period of time. Documented malnutrition. Current weight 134 pounds against a frame the VA records showed had carried 157 pounds 2 years ago. Evidence of chronic undertreatment of documented nerve pain, visible in the muscle tension patterns and in Marcus's own account of when he had last received his prescribed medication. She looked at Thomas when she finished. "How long was he in that facility?" she asked. 13 months, Thomas said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Thank you for getting him here when you did." Thomas nodded once. He held the folded blanket. "Can I take this in?" he asked. She smiled. A brief thing. A tired thing. Real. "Room 7, she said. Marcus was sitting up in the hospital bed when Thomas came in, dressed in a hospital gown, his silver star on the tray table beside the bed where he had placed it himself, within reach. He looked at Thomas, at the blanket. "You thought ahead," he said. "Force of habit," Thomas said. He draped the blanket over Marcus's lap and sat in the chair beside the bed. The room smelled like antiseptic and the faint warmth of the heating vent above the door. Through the window, the blizzard had dropped to intermittent flurries. The worst of it passed. The sky, the particular flat white of a winter morning that has spent itself. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now," Thomas said, "you get treated properly. After that, we work on the rest." He handed Marcus a phone, a simple prepaid model, fully charged. "Chalk got your grandniece last night. She knows everything. She's on her way from Cincinnati. Should be here by noon." Marcus looked at the phone. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he had lost access to and had stopped expecting to hold again. He set it down carefully on the tray table next to the silver star. "She believed them," he said, "about the dementia, the behavioral issues." "She believes you now," Thomas said. "That's what matters." Marcus was quiet. He pressed his hand flat against the tray table, not the metal, just the surface, just the solidity of something real and warm. Then he said, to the window more than to Thomas, "I kept counting. At the bus stop. I counted because if I stopped counting, I was afraid I'd go somewhere I couldn't come back from." A pause. "I got to 247 cracks in the sidewalk." Thomas said nothing. He sat with that. "You kept yourself here," he said finally. That's not a small thing. The housing solution came together in 48 hours, which is fast by any standard, and possible only when 75 people are working on different parts of the same problem simultaneously. Patricia Kowalski Sims, Raymond Kowalski's daughter, who had spent 14 months trying to contest the ruling on her father's death and had been told the case was closed, had driven up from Akron the morning after the arrests. She arrived at the Route 18 clubhouse at 11 a.m., with a 3-inch folder of documentation she had assembled over a year of being dismissed by people with forms and filing deadlines, and she sat down with verdict and said simply, "Tell me how I help." She was a property manager, had been for 20 years. She had a rental unit on the ground floor of a 2-story building in Medina. Accessible, modified bathroom, wide doorways, street-level entrance, the kind of unit she had been quietly and intentionally keeping available for a specific kind of tenant, because her father's experience had done something permanent to her understanding of what the word available meant. She offered it to Marcus at a rate the chapter's emergency fund. $38,000 raised across 3 chapters in a single online fundraising push that Cypher posted at 6 a.m. and that reached its target by 2 p.m. Could cover for the first year, with the VA pension reinstated and the aid and attendance benefit formally redirected to Marcus's own account, expected to cover the ongoing cost thereafter. The key was a physical key on a simple key ring. No facility badge, no staff authorization required, no process to follow to unlock your own door. Robert drove Marcus to the apartment on Thursday afternoon. Patricia met them there. Marcus sat in his wheelchair in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the apartment, the wide entrance, the afternoon light coming through south-facing windows, a small kitchen visible beyond the living area, a bedroom door standing open. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has constructed an entire interior architecture to stop hoping for, and then finds himself holding. He rolled through the doorway. He stopped in the center of the living room. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "There's a place for the dog." Robert looked at him. "Porter," Marcus said. "My service dog. They surrendered him to the county shelter 13 months ago." He looked at the corner near the window, the specific kind of corner a large dog picks for a bed because it is safe from 3 sides. "I don't know if he's still there." Cypher, standing in the hallway with his phone, typed the name of the county shelter into his screen before Marcus finished the sentence. Porter, a yellow Labrador, now 5 years old, a certified service animal, surrendered with a notation reading, "Owner placed in long-term care. Animal no longer required," was in the county shelter's long-term care unit, which was the shelter's way of saying the animals that didn't get adopted quickly, the ones that waited. Porter had been waiting for 13 months. He came home on Saturday. Marcus's grandniece, Denise Hayes Carver, 41, arrived from Cincinnati at 12:20 p.m. on Wednesday. She sat with Marcus for 3 hours. No staff filtered the conversation. No behavioral log was open on a desktop somewhere. No one from the facility called afterward to frame the visit as an elevated concern period. She cried for about the first 15 minutes. Marcus did not. He sat across from her in the hospital room and held both her hands in his cracked, frost-bitten hands and said, "They were good at it. You couldn't have known. I need you to understand that." She said she should have pushed harder. He said, "You're here now. That's the only direction we go." When she left to find coffee, he picked up the silver star from the tray table, held it for a moment, set it back down. He started counting again. Not out of fear this time, out of habit. The ceiling tiles, the lights above the bed. He stopped at 3 and smiled at something private. Scene by scene, the logistics assembled themselves with the specific competence of men who specialized in different things and understood that competence, directed correctly, was the most meaningful form of care. Chalk, the former high school principal, the one who kept calm while everyone else was still in motion, handled the VA reinstatement paperwork, walking Denise through the process on Wednesday afternoon at a table in the hospital family room. The benefit account, formally closed by Whitmore's fraudulent discharge authorization, was flagged for emergency reinstatement by the VA regional director in Akron, a call Terry Mack placed on his own authority, citing an ongoing federal investigation on Wednesday morning. Verdict handled the protective legal measures. A court order filed at 9 a.m. Wednesday prohibiting Whitmore or any Sycamore Ridge employee from contacting Marcus or Denise, an emergency declaration stripping Whitmore of his administrative authority over the facility effective immediately, and a formal victim status designation for Marcus in the federal investigation that triggered the advocate assignment Agent Reyes had confirmed by noon. Thomas handled the medical follow-up, scheduling Marcus's first appointment with a VA physician who had reviewed the full chart and who, upon seeing the record of withheld nerve pain medications against Marcus's documented spinal injury, said 3 words in the hallway that Thomas remembered for a long time. This was deliberate. And on Saturday afternoon, when Porter, the yellow lab, 5 years old, 13 months waiting, was brought through the door of the apartment on a leash held by Cypher, who had driven to the shelter himself, Marcus was sitting in his wheelchair in the center of the living room. Porter crossed the room in a straight line and put his head in Marcus's lap. Marcus put both hands on the dog's ears. He said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The apartment smelled like coffee Denise had made in the kitchen and the specific clean warmth of a heated space that was no longer institutional. Through the south-facing windows, the last of the November light was going the way it goes in Ohio in late autumn. Not dramatically, just quietly withdrawing, the way daylight knows to leave when it's done. Robert watched from the hallway, through the open door. He had not planned to stay. He had planned to hand Marcus the extra set of keys and leave. He stayed for another minute. What he felt was not pride. It was not satisfaction, exactly. It was the specific grief that lives in the same room as relief. The understanding that the man in that chair had spent 13 months in a 9 by 11-foot room with a disconnected call button, and that no amount of right action in the present could return what had been taken from him, only work around the absence of it. He didn't say this to anyone. He put his helmet on in the parking lot, started the engine, rode. But this story isn't really about a nursing home, or a bus stop, or a man in a wheelchair in the snow. It's about what it costs a society when it decides some people are no longer worth the trouble of seeing. 7 months later. Marcus Eldon Hayes turned 83 in June, at a picnic table outside the Route 18 clubhouse, in weather that was the exact opposite of the night they'd found him. Warm and still, the kind of Ohio summer evening that smells like cut grass and motor oil, and the particular sweetness of charcoal just past its peak. Porter was under the table. Denise was there, and Patricia Kowalski-Sims, and Thomas, and Chalk, who had brought a German chocolate cake because he had asked Denise what Marcus's favorite was and had not been satisfied with "anything is fine." Verdict came late, straight from a meeting at the federal courthouse that he was not yet at liberty to describe, but whose outcome was visible in the set of his face when he walked in, the specific settled quality of a man who has seen a long thing reach its conclusion. Cipher had made a sign. It said, "Happy Birthday, Ironclad's Problem Now," with an arrow pointing at Marcus. Marcus had laughed when he saw it. A genuine laugh. Not the careful, managed thing a man produces when he is not sure whether laughter is safe. A real one, full and unguarded. He ate 2 pieces of cake. He had gained 9 pounds since November. His hands were no longer cracked. The frostbite on the 3 fingers of his right hand had healed with minimal residual sensitivity. Thomas had checked twice. He had a new power wheelchair, custom built by 3 chapter members, and a machinist in Akron who had done the framework at cost, because Cipher had explained the situation, and the machinist had said he'd served 2 years in the Army, and that was all the explanation he required. The Silver Star was mounted in a small welded bracket on the frame. Cleaned, restored, the pewter dark silver brought back toward its original brightness by a chapter member who restored antique motorcycles and understood metal. It was positioned where Marcus could see it when he rode. He could see it now. He looked at it for a moment, in the summer evening light, and then looked away. Not dismissively, but with the ease of a man who no longer needs to grip the thing to believe it's there. The Sycamore Ridge investigation closed its federal phase 9 months after the night on Granger Mill Road, with a result that Patricia Kowalski Sims framed and hung in her office in Akron, and that Terry Mack kept a copy of in his desk drawer at the VA regional office in a manila envelope labeled simply "Done." Gerald Allen Whitmore was convicted on 5 of 6 counts. The negligent homicide charge related to Raymond Kowalski was reduced to criminal negligence, resulting in death on the jury's recommendation, which carried the same sentencing weight and which the prosecutor accepted because the jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours, and the verdict on the remaining 5 counts was unanimous. He was sentenced to 14 years in Ohio State Prison, with no parole eligibility for 9 years. He had maintained his innocence through the entirety of the trial. In the courtroom, on the day of sentencing, he had worn a pressed gray suit and his reading glasses, and had looked, to the observer in the gallery, very much like the man who had introduced guest speakers at the Medina Rotary Club's Veterans Day luncheon 3 years running. He sat with the particular stillness of someone who had finally stopped performing and discovered there was nothing underneath the performance to fall back on. When the sentence was read, he looked at his hands. Darren Howell cooperated fully with the federal investigation and received a plea agreement. 18 months of supervised probation, a $200,000 civil restitution contribution to a victim compensation fund established for the 3 families, and a permanent bar from employment in any federally regulated healthcare billing capacity. He did not appeal. He was, by all accounts, a man who had made a calculation and paid for it, and who would spend the remainder of his life in the specific company of that knowledge. The Ohio Board of Nursing Home Administrators revised its inspection protocol in January, requiring unannounced inspections of any facility with a pattern of late discharge billing, and mandating that inspectors conduct private resident interviews without facility staff present. The revision was named the Hayes Protocol in committee, but was entered into the official record simply as Amendment 14A. Marcus was informed of this by Verdict, who had been consulted during the drafting process. Marcus said, "Good." That was all. Sycamore Ridge Care Center was placed under emergency state receivership in December. The East Corridor was the first wing cleared of residents and audited. Room 14E, the 9 by 11-foot room at the end of the corridor, the call button disconnected at the base, the window facing the concrete service wall, was photographed, documented, and included as evidence in the federal trial. It was subsequently renovated under state supervision, the call button replaced with a full alert system, the mattress replaced, the thermostat calibrated and locked to a minimum of 70 degrees. The new residents on the East Corridor had no idea what the room had been. Someone should tell them. Not to frighten them, to let them know that someone had already paid attention, so they didn't have to pay for it again. 2 years after the night on Granger Mill Road. Beverly Oaks passed her recertification examination and returned to work as a certified nursing aide, not at a private facility this time, but at the Medina County Veterans Home, a state-operated facility whose residents were, by definition, the people she had spent 4 years trying to protect in a place that hadn't wanted them protected. She still had the spiral notebook. She kept it in her work bag, not to look at, just to carry. Some things you carry not because you need them, but because they're the record of the person you decided to stop being. She mentored 2 younger aides in the first year, both women in their 20s who were learning the work, and who were, she could see, the kind of people who would notice things, and might, without guidance, tell themselves it wasn't their place to say so. She told them both the same thing. If you see something wrong with a resident's care, your instinct to report it is not an imposition. It is the job. The whole job. The thing they hired you to do, and the thing that nobody can make you stop doing unless you decide to stop. She told them this in the break room, over coffee, the way things that matter are usually said, not as a speech, just as a fact, passed from one person to the next across a table. The way truth moves when it moves at all. 3 years after. Marcus Eldon Hayes was contacted by the Ohio Long-Term Care Ombudsman's office in the spring, not as a subject of an investigation, but as a potential consultant. The office was revising its resident rights training curriculum and wanted input from someone with direct experience of the system's gaps from the inside. He agreed to 1 meeting, which became 4 meetings, which became a standing quarterly consultation that his VA transportation benefit covered, and that Porter attended, lying under the conference room table with his chin on his paws, while Marcus described in the measured and deliberate baritone of a man who chose his words in combat and still did. Exactly what it felt like to have a call button disconnected above your bed, and no phone, and a corridor door that locked from the outside, and a staff trained to document every complaint as a behavioral event. He did not perform distress in these meetings. He stated facts. He let the facts be what they were. At the 3rd meeting, a young staffer, a woman in her late 20s, clearly new, taking notes on a laptop, looked up during a pause and said, "Can I ask what made you decide to keep talking about this, after everything?" Marcus considered the question the way he considered all questions, fully, without rushing. "I passed a bus stop on Fenwick Road last month," he said. "Late afternoon. There was an older gentleman sitting on the bench, cane, winter jacket, 1 bag on the ground next to him. He had the look," he paused. "You learn to recognize the look. It's the face of someone who has been failed enough times to stop expecting anything, but hasn't quite decided to stop hoping." He looked at the young staffer. "I pulled over, asked if he was all right. He was waiting for a nephew who was running late. He was fine." He put his hand on the table. Not the metal, not anything, just his hand, flat on the surface. "But I pulled over. That's the part that's different now." He looked at the window. "For a long time I counted things because it kept me from disappearing. Telephone poles, cracks in sidewalks, cars passing at bus stops." A pause. "I still count, but now I count different things." He looked at the young staffer. "I count the people I didn't drive past." Robert Malone was not at the birthday party in June when the verdict came in. He was in Lorain County, where a 17-year-old boy with a broken arm and a fabricated story about how it happened had been walked into the county emergency room by a neighbor who had finally, after 2 months, knocked on the door that kept closing. Robert had gotten the call at 6 a.m. He had left by 6:15. He rode point, as always. He had a folder on his phone, created the night Marcus Hayes was discharged from Medina County Hospital, updated every time a case resolved, labeled with 3 words that no one else had ever seen, because it wasn't for anyone else. Why We Ride. It contained a photograph of Marcus in the new power wheelchair, Porter beside him, in the parking lot outside the VA Medical Center on a Tuesday in February, the silver star mounted in its bracket, the sun at an angle that made the restored metal catch light. Marcus is looking at the camera, and his expression is not the expression of a man who has been rescued. It is the expression of a man who is not finished. There were 11 other photographs in the folder, each one a person who had come home because someone had answered. Robert rode north on Route 18 in early November, the road wet from overnight rain, the trees stripped bare, the sky the flat gray of Ohio autumn. He had ridden this road 1,000 times. He knew every curve, every frost heave, every place where the pavement darkened under the overpass and emerged on the other side into open air. He passed the intersection of Granger Mill and Copperfield Avenue at 7:14 a.m. The bus stop bench was empty. The corrugated shelter stood with all its panels intact. Someone had replaced the missing one over the summer, or possibly years ago. He had just never noticed, because there had never been a reason to look. He did not slow down, but he looked. He had lost his father in a shared room with a non-functioning call button. He had carried a laminated prayer for 33 years, and he had not figured out, in all that time, how to make the system move faster than it moved. He had not solved that problem. He had not replaced the system, or repaired it, or made it into something it wasn't designed to be. What he had done was show up at a curb at 11:27 p.m. and crouch in wet snow and put his hand on a wheelchair armrest and say, "Someone is now. You're not alone." That was not a complicated thing. It was a small thing performed at exactly the right moment. The road curved north, the trees thinned. The sky opened up over a long, flat stretch of Ohio farmland, brown and waiting for winter, the horizon wide and unobstructed. He thought about his father, about the call button, about the 16 months in the shared room and the 3 denied claims and the records that the VA had lost twice and never apologized for losing. He thought about what his father had said the day he shipped out, pressing the laminated prayer into his hand. Not be careful and not come back safe, but pay attention. That's all. Just pay attention. He had been paying attention for 33 years. He reached into his left breast pocket, the one with the specific crease, the one that hadn't changed in 3 decades, and touched the laminated edge. Still there. He kept riding. There is a word for what Marcus Hayes spent 13 months surviving, and it is not one word. It is a system of small cruelties, each one deniable on its own. Each one designed to remain invisible unless someone was paying close enough attention to see the pattern. Disconnected call buttons, withheld medication, forged signatures, filtered phone calls, a door at the end of a corridor that self-locked from the outside. None of those things announce themselves as evil. They announce themselves as procedure, as protocol, as the way things are done. And the distance between the way things are done and the way things are done to people who have no one watching is the distance inside which Gerald Whitmore had operated for 5 years. If you have a parent in a facility, if you have a neighbor you haven't checked on, an uncle who sounds strange on the phone, an older person in your life whose world has gotten quieter and smaller in ways you've told yourself are normal. This story is asking you to look again. Not with suspicion, with attention. Ask the uncomfortable question. Stay for the answer. Make the phone call you've been meaning to make for 3 months. Visit in the middle of the week when visits are unexpected. Ask to see the room. Ask what the call button does. You do not need 75 motorcycles to change what happens to someone. You need to be the person who doesn't drive past the bus stop. You need to pull over. Before I go, if this story hit close to home, here are real places to turn. In the United States, call the Elder Care Locator at 1-800-677-1116. Free, government-run, connects you to local services in every state. Or visit longtermcare.gov to file a complaint about any nursing facility. In the United Kingdom, contact Age UK at 008006781602 or the Care Quality Commission at cqc.org.uk to report concerns about a care home. In Canada, each province has a long-term care ombudsman. Search your province, long-term care complaint, and the office comes up directly. In Australia, call the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission at 1-800-9-518-22. Free, confidential, handles complaints about any registered facility. In Vietnam and Southeast Asia, contact your country's Ministry of Health Elder Welfare Division or reach out to local veterans associations who often have direct advocacy channels. You do not have to know everything to make the call. You just have to make it. The number costs nothing. The call might save everything. If this story stayed with you, subscribe Valiant Bikers so we can keep telling the ones that don't get told anywhere else. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And in the comments, tell me, was there a moment in your own life when someone showed up for you, or when you showed up for someone else, even when you weren't sure it was your place? Tell me that story. I'll read everyone. On a Tuesday night in late November, at a bus stop at the corner of Granger Mill Road and Copperfield Avenue, an 82-year-old man in an oversized field jacket sat in a manual wheelchair in 19-degree weather and asked a stranger 5 words that contained an entire life. What he didn't know yet was that the stranger had been waiting for 22 years to be the answer to exactly that question. He just hadn't known who was going to ask it. He does now.